Welcome to another episode of Today in Space. We're here to celebrate and talk about the Boeing Starliner CFT launch, the first humans to fly on board the Starliner spacecraft from Boeing. Let's talk about what happened, what this means for commercial crew, what this means for the U.S., and just a story of when things don't go right, keep pushing, keep finding solutions, and eventually you'll get there. And that's Boeing Starliner's story here. Let's break it down in this launch breakdown for this episode. Thank you for joining us. Let's dive in. All right, folks, welcome to another episode of the podcast. On June 5th, Boeing's Starliner spacecraft took off from Florida on an Atlas V rocket and successfully got to orbit and then ended up docking with the space station. The astronauts, Suni Butch, Wilmore, they are on board the ISS back in what they would call home in zero-G and in space, and it's a really beautiful moment. I mean, for those who want to learn more about the story of Boeing Starliner, we did an episode a few weeks back that covered that entire story, and we'll try and squeeze it down here, but we really recommend going back a few episodes and watching that. But the Starliner has experienced, and Boeing's space team has experienced challenge after challenge with this program here, and it's not to say that SpaceX hadn't also experienced the same problems, but the Boeing Starliner was one of two spacecraft chosen for the commercial crew program. And back in 2014, this commercial crew program was created, and when they were chosen, Boeing received a $4.2 billion contract to develop Starliner, and SpaceX got one worth $2.6 billion. In 2020, SpaceX successfully performed their Demo 2 mission with astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, and they flew on the Dragon spacecraft for the first time, docked with the space station, and since then they've been performing operational flights because they had qualified Dragon to be able to do this. It's a human-rated spacecraft. And Boeing was able to conduct that test for their first astronauts with the CFT launch. Astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams were the flight participants of this test. They will go down in the books as the people who were the first to ride, just like Bob and Doug, on the Starliner. And the Starliner still had so much that it had to deal with on its way to orbit. But it's a really good piece of perspective that the Starliner is only the sixth human-rated spacecraft to ever have a flight test done. So when you think about that, goes back to the early days of the U.S. space program. So there aren't even that many humans that have performed a flight test like this of a human-rated spacecraft. And even cooler, Sunita Williams becomes the first woman to be a part of a flight test. So some really groundbreaking things happening here. But it's also been a story of challenges as well, and I think that's a good thing, and I'll explain here in just a second. But Starliner obviously was delayed 4 years farther, 3 really, if we'll just give them 3 years here, than SpaceX for the same type of test, getting paid more money here. But just because they were paid more money does not necessarily mean that they're going to have less problems, right? One of the things that Starliner has is plenty of redundancy, right? They had experienced some helium leaks on this spacecraft when they were first testing it, but they have multiple of these valves, so having a certain leak for the helium wasn't that big a deal. And on this mission, they ended up having 2 helium leaks, and when they got to orbit, but they also were able to deal with it. While the spacecraft got to orbit, 5 of the 28 control thrusters that, once Boeing Starliner separates from the Atlas V rocket, it takes itself with its thrusters the rest of the way to orbit to the space station. And, with all that redundancy, they were able to, 23 out of 28 thrusters, they were still able to dock successfully with the space station. And so the crew's there. And so now, even with all of that, even going through all of the struggles, delays, second scrub that happened at the end of May, on that second scrub, it wasn't even Starliner, it was the Atlas V that had an issue. And they had to take the rocket and the spacecraft off the pad, but they found that the ground launch system, the GLS, one of those boards had a power failure. So they swapped out the board. They were able to check everything out, and everything went flawlessly for the United Launch Alliance team, and they got to orbit. And that's ultimately what we're focusing on, right? Like, now the commercial crew program and everything that was trying to help the U.S. program have not only redundancy, right? Like having multiple spacecraft that the U.S. could use to go to space, like that's a huge benefit of having Starliner and Dragon. It's something that the space shuttle didn't have, right? The space shuttle struggled in a few periods where either the option to have an extra space shuttle to save crew, or the option to have another space shuttle in case that space shuttle was having issues with leaks, and that's the summer of hydrogen, right? In 1990, we did a space story episode about that. But America's space program has never had two at the same time, right? That's just not something we've had available. And so, what does that do? What does that change our decision making from NASA? What does that do for potential challenges that we experience in the future here, right? Like, knock on wood, we want every mission to be successful, but if there's anything we can learn from the history of space, it was only 2 missions from Apollo 11, the most perfect mission that could have ever happened, and mind-blowing, humans touch foot on the surface of another orbiting body for the first time, right? 2 missions later had to deal with how to bring their astronauts back home when they had an explosion on board and made it impossible for that lander to actually make it, and how do they adjust, and like Apollo 13 is the epitome of a successful failure, right? They saved the crew. And with the space shuttle program, some could argue that not being able to have a more reliable launch cadence, right, 4 months before at the earliest before the next space shuttle could be prepped to launch, if you have anything wrong, the pressure of needing to get a launch off and to keep the program going can get the best of all of us, even the smartest people like the people at NASA. So can having 2 different spacecraft help us in making smarter decisions and better decisions about our planning of the schedule of astronauts going into space? How can we alleviate the stress of trying to find all that time? How can we make better decisions when and if we have to deal with a spacecraft that's at the station that has a leak? We had that happen with the Soyuz. It was a leak small enough that they felt it was, acceptable to still stay. But, what happens if we need a lifeboat sent to the space station? 4 months is unacceptable in that scenario. So if we have SpaceX that can launch, a crewed spacecraft and have rockets at the ready, or plan for that contingency with how much they fly, and the Atlas V from United Launch Alliance and Boeing having more of these spacecraft at the ready, it makes it possible. It makes it possible for us to have crew top of mind no matter what, because we eliminate a lot of the risk of just having the one spacecraft. And the real beautiful thing in my mind is just the U.S. having its own launch independence. When the space shuttle was retired in 2011, there was no option for us to send humans to the space station to keep things running all the time. We were able to do that by paying the Russians for a seat for astronauts on their Soyuz system, an ancient system but a reliable system, that has been working since the very early days of the space program. But that was not sustainable, and that's why there were people who fought hard for the space program to implement this commercial crew program. Take away the economic viability or functionality, putting it all on NASA's shoulders of you need to build the rocket, you need to, launch it, you need to crew, you need all the operations done. What if a company was able to make money and do it on their own and take the risk on their back to then allow NASA to say, no, things are not ready, right? NASA was in a really rough place during the space shuttle era where there was no separation between the decision of, is this okay to fly and should we fly? Thinking back, as we think about all this human spacecraft, all this human spaceflight that's happening, it's a really, really good time to reflect on the shuttle program and the lives that were lost and the decisions or non-decisions that were made that caused that to happen, and the succumbing to the pressure of what happens if you have 8 scrubs and the media is barking down your door about when is this going to happen. Is the space program worth it anymore? In some ways, this gives NASA the out to say, look, it doesn't reach our standards. We don't want to risk these astronaut lives. And we've got 2 options, right? Like, now NASA can say, hey, there's something going on here. Let's just say in the scenario, a SpaceX spacecraft is having an issue. They can say, SpaceX, try and figure out a solution. Do you have an extra one? Boeing, get your Starliner ready. We need to push you forward so that we can have a backup here for the crew. We've got space weather. We've got so many different things, including just the space station being older. Like, we don't know all the little micrometeorites, all the debris that's up in space right now. Like, there's so many different small scenarios that having the ability for an extra spacecraft just makes us more resilient and more able to be in control of our own destiny and not just have to send people home and make a not so safe decision. And I look forward to the challenges that they're going to have to face and succeed in. And, the Boeing team, having it be such a monolithic, company in the space program in the space industry, right? Like, Boeing is a huge company. Lockheed Martin, they're all huge companies. Even the United Launch Alliance, a huge company that has lots of storied history. Even just being in that position and having all that experience does not mean you're going to have an easy time in space. And I think it's good that the Boeing teams were able to experience this hardship early, before the first astronauts made it to orbit, so that they can become hardened and resilient to the challenges that are going to lay ahead. And so I think it's great. I am super happy that we have so many options for space. If you think about 10 years ago, 14 years ago, it's a very different space industry than we had before, and we're blessed. I'm grateful that we have all of this, and we all should be. We should be very proud of what the space industry has done to turn itself around in the last decade and a half. So a big congratulations to the Boeing team, to the Atlas team at the ULA. Atlas rockets sending astronauts into space again since the early, it has been since the early days of the space program. But a lot to be happy about, a lot to be excited about, and just best of luck to the teams qualifying this on the rest of their trip. And then the astronauts will return home and make it back. And the great thing is, now, if anything does happen in the future, we don't have to make rushed decisions, right? I know we talked about this ad nauseum, but it's so important to bring up. Having backup options is something we should say is a mandatory thing moving forward for spaceflight, if it's possible, right? And I think it's only possible with the combined nature of private and public space programs. So we're very excited. There's going to be plenty of private stations, space stations that will come out, whether they replace the ISS or whether they're in there in addition to the ISS. You've got Axiom Space, you've got Bigelow Space, you've got Vast space, so many different private industry folk that are building solutions so that NASA can play quarterback and not frontline and quarterback and special teams. Like, NASA can just focus on big picture stuff and focusing the effort of space travel and our astronauts. So really a fantastic week in space, and I can't say enough about it. Please let us know what you think about this spacecraft, the Boeing Starliner. What do you think about it? Did you see that video of one of the astronauts waving from the window to the people on the ISS? I mean, it's kind of beautiful how massive all this is, and just a reminder that there are humans on board. So we enter this cool phase of the space program for the first time with 2 spacecraft rated for humans, and the next one very close to being approved for full operational long-duration space. Way to go, Boeing Space Team. You made it to the finish line here, and the journey has only begun. Good luck on the rest of your test. Suni and Butch, enjoy your time on the space station. They've said it's home for them, and I'm just really looking forward to all the content and the adventure that they're going to share with everyone here. So that's it, folks. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Spread love, spread science, and we'll see you on the next episode of Today in Space. Be well.